Hey everyone, and welcome to The Deep Dive. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of American millionaires today. We've got some really interesting excerpts from the book The Millionaire Next Door, and we want to try to help you guys unlock some of the secrets to building wealth. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, this book is packed with insights that I think challenge a lot of our assumptions about what it means to be wealthy.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that surprised me was how the book just totally debunks the image of like the flashy millionaire, the one who's always wearing designer clothes, driving a luxury car. It turns out that's not always the case, is it?
It's not. It's funny that the book really it talks about these two sort of personality types. There's the pause, which stands for prodigious accumulators of wealth,
I love that.
and the UAWs, which are the underaccumulators of wealth.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is that those flashy spenders, the ones who seem to have it all, they're often the UAWs. They're living paycheck to paycheck, even though they have these high incomes. And the real millionaires, the pawdays, they're often masters of frugality. They're more interested in saving and investing their money than they are in displaying it for everyone to see.
It's like that saying, it's not about how much you make, but how much you keep. And the book has some pretty wild examples. Like, remember Johnny Lucas, the millionaire who bragged about never spending more than $399 on a suit?
Oh, yeah. It's a classic example of how paws think, right? They get that spending a ton of money on a fancy suit doesn't actually mean you're successful.
Oh, yeah. It makes you really question your own priorities, right?
Yeah,
What are some of those unconscious beliefs that we all have about what wealth looks like?
definitely. And the book actually gives us a tool to kind of check ourselves. They call it the wealth equation.
Oh, yeah, the wealth equation. This is such a fascinating concept. Tell me more about it.
So it's basically expected net worth equals 1/10 of your age multiplied by your income. And basically what it does is it helps you figure out if you're on track with your wealth building or if you're kind of falling behind where you should be based on your age and how much you make.
Yeah, like a financial reality check, huh?
Exactly. And they use this equation in the book to compare these two different types of millionaires, right? There's Charles Bobbins, who was a fireman, and then you've got Dr. John Ashton, who's a physician.
Okay.
And Charles, even though he didn't have a very high income as a fireman, his net worth was way higher than you'd expect for his age. So technically, according to the equation, he's wealthy. But John, on the other hand, even though he was making way more money as a doctor, had a net worth that was lower than expected. So even though he was technically a millionaire, he was considered an underaccumulator.
So that's so interesting. It really does come down to how you manage your money, not just how much you make. And the book goes even deeper into this with these two doctors, Dr. North and Dr. South. And they both had really similar incomes, but their net worths were completely different. What was going on there?
So Dr. North, he was like super disciplined. The guy tracked every penny that his family spent. They used a strict budget, made sure they lived well below their means. And Dr. South, not so much. No real control over spending, multiple credit cards at all the fancy department stores. They would even make big purchases without talking to each other about it.
Wow. So like Dr. North is the ultimate budgeter and Dr. South is more like treat yourself.
Exactly. And it highlights this concept of frugality that's such a core idea in the Millionaire Next Door,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not about like depriving yourself or living like a monk, but it's about being intentional with your money,
Yeah.
resisting that urge to overspend.
And that seems to be like a common thread with all these millionaires, regardless of background.
It is. Yeah, it is. And there's this other interesting thing that the book points out about millionaires' backgrounds. It turns out that certain ancestry groups have a much higher concentration of millionaires than others.
Really? Now that is fascinating. Tell me more about that.
For example, people of Scottish descent, they tend to have, on average, a lower income, but they've got a much higher concentration of millionaires than a lot of other groups.
Hmm.
And what's really interesting is it's not because they're inheriting all this money, because the book also tells us that 80% of American millionaires are first-generation rich. So it's not coming from family money. It's about that mentality of saving and being disciplined with their finances.
It really is like a universal language, this frugality. Now, the book also dives into this concept called economic outpatient care, or EOC. Can you explain what that is and why it matters?
Yeah, EOC is basically when parents or grandparents give a lot of financial help to their adult children or grandchildren, like helping with a down payment on a house, paying off student loans, just giving regular cash gifts. And the book argues that while those gestures come from a good place, they can actually end up hurting their chances of building wealth in the long run.
That seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Why would giving money to your loved ones be a bad thing?
It's not always bad, but it can be, especially if it creates a pattern where someone becomes dependent on that help. They use this example of Mary and Lamar, who are a couple who relied super heavily on financial assistance from Mary's mom their whole adult lives. Everything from buying homes to paying for private school for their kids.
Okay, wow. That is generous, but I can see how that could be a problem.
It seems like they never really learned to manage their own money because they always knew Mary's mom would be there to bail them out.
It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. So if just giving money isn't always the answer, what are some better ways to help the next generation financially?
The book talks about transferring what they call productive assets. So things that can help someone build wealth for themselves and become more self-sufficient. Things like education, investing in a business venture, or even gifting stocks that could grow in value over time.
It's about giving them the tools to succeed on their own.
Exactly. And they make this point really clear with the stories of these two brothers. Henry, who was a teacher, and then Josh, who was this high-earning attorney.
Okay, I am interested. Tell me about them.
So Henry, even though he had a pretty modest teacher's salary, was incredibly disciplined with his finances. He was really good at budgeting, lived well below his means, and invested his savings wisely. Josh, on the other hand, was making a ton of money as an attorney, but he was also getting regular cash gifts from his parents. And because of that, he tended to be more free with his spending and wasn't as diligent about investing.
Wait, are you saying the teacher ended up wealthier than the high-powered lawyer?
Yeah. It's one of those counterintuitive things, but it shows that discipline and good financial habits can be more powerful than just a high income. The book even has this term for it, weakening the weak. Sometimes giving too much financial help can actually make people more dependent, not less.
That is such a powerful lesson. It's not always about giving handouts. It's about teaching people how to fish so they can provide for themselves.
Yeah, it's a tough thing, trying to find that balance, right? And, speaking of helping others, the Millionaire Next Door actually talks about this whole industry that caters specifically to affluent people.
That sounds kind of niche, though. Like, why should the average person care about what millionaires spend their money on?
Well, it's like getting a glimpse into a world that most of us don't see every day. And by understanding what wealthy people need and what they like, you can actually gain some really valuable insights into things like estate planning, how to optimize your taxes, all kinds of specialized services.
So, like, what kinds of businesses are we talking about here? What kind of professionals are catering to this market?
Well, you've got lawyers who specialize in estate planning, CPAs who help with those super complicated tax strategies, luxury travel agents, high-end real estate brokers, even private schools play a role in this whole ecosystem.
It's like a whole world built around managing wealth.
Hmm.
But, even if we're not millionaires ourselves, knowing how this market works can still be helpful, right?
Absolutely. For example, by learning how rich people prioritize minimizing their taxes, it might give you ideas for investments that could offer tax advantages. Or, seeing how they value these specialized services. Maybe that sparks an idea for a business that caters to a niche within that market.
It's about connecting those dots and finding opportunity, huh? Now, another thing that I found really interesting in The Millionaire Next Door was how much they emphasize the mindset of millionaires. And not just like those who inherited their money, but the ones who built it themselves.
Yeah, they really get into the habits and the thinking that sets those self-made millionaires apart. And, the cool thing is, there's some key takeaways that anyone can apply to their own lives, no matter how much money they make.
So what are some of those actionable things our listeners can start using today to cultivate that millionaire mindset?
The book highlights a few key principles. First, you got to start investing early, even if it's just small amounts. That compound interest is a powerful thing, and the sooner you start, the more time your money has to grow. Second, you need to plan and budget carefully. Yeah. Track your spending, find places where you can cut back, and make saving a regular habit.
Don't let it just disappear. Be intentional with it.
Exactly. And third, when you're looking for professional advice, be really strategic about it. Look for people who have a proven track record, people who come highly recommended by others who are already financially successful. Don't fall for the fancy brochures or the big promises.
Do your homework. It's your money. You got to protect it. Now, the book also talks about the types of businesses that millionaires tend to own. What did you learn about that?
Well, what I thought was really interesting is they analyzed IRS data and found that a lot of millionaires own businesses in sectors like manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade.
Those aren't exactly the most glamorous industries, are they?
Not really. They're not flashy or high profile, but they tend to be very profitable and create consistent cash flow. It kind of challenges that idea that you need to be in some super sexy industry to build wealth.
It's about finding a niche and serving a need, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And being able to manage it effectively, making smart decisions, putting in the work.
So it's really a combination of things. The opportunity, the mindset, the actions, it all comes together.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about cars. I know this might seem random, but the book had some interesting stuff about millionaires' car buying habits. What stood out to you?
Well, what surprised me was that a lot of millionaires, even the ones making serious bank, they choose to buy used cars. They get that new cars lose value really quickly, so they're willing to pass on that new car smell to save some money.
They're seeing the value, not the hype.
Exactly. They're not afraid to be smart consumers and look for deals, even if they could easily afford to buy whatever they want.
That's such a good reminder. Wealth doesn't mean you stop caring about getting a good deal. And honestly, that mindset is probably what helped them become wealthy in the first place.
Right.
Now, another topic that a lot of people have questions about is financial advisors. What does the book say about how millionaires choose and work with these advisors?
Well, one thing they found is that PAWs, unlike those UAWs, almost never hire financial advisors based on cold calls or fancy brochures. They're much more likely to get recommendations from people they trust, like their accountant or other successful individuals.
Word of mouth is the best advertising.
Yeah. And the book really emphasizes that hiring a financial advisor is like hiring any other important employee. You wouldn't just pick someone random off the street without checking their references and making sure they're qualified. You got to do your research and find someone who's both competent and trustworthy.
It makes sense. It's your financial well-being we're talking about here. Now, another thing that's really important is passing on those values of financial responsibility to the next generation. What does the Millionaire Next Door say about how millionaires raise their kids to be smart with money?
This is a really fascinating part of the book. A lot of parents who are affluent, especially the ones who built their own wealth, they're really aware of the potential downsides of raising kids with a sense of entitlement. They know that just giving their kids money isn't going to set them up for success.
It's about instilling that work ethic, the value of discipline, and earning your own way.
Right. It's not about hiding your wealth from your kids, but about teaching them the right lessons about money and responsibility. They use the example of Dr. North, who had this set of rules for raising his kids. He taught them to be tough, to never feel sorry for themselves, to live below their means, and to work hard.
It's those core values that matter for financial success and for being a good person.
Exactly. And it's also important to avoid constantly comparing yourself to your kids or reminding them of your own accomplishments.
Why is that? Why is that important?
The book suggests that constantly comparing yourself to your children, especially when it comes to money, can create pressure and resentment. It's better to let them define their own path and measure success on their own terms.
It's recognizing that their version of success might not look like yours, and that's okay.
Yeah. The book encourages parents to be more like supportive mentors, giving guidance and encouragement, but without stifling their kids' independence.
And speaking of independence, we talked earlier about economic outpatient care and how it can sometimes get in the way of that. The book seems to advocate for striking that balance, right, between supporting your kids and encouraging them to be self-sufficient.
Right. Like helping with education or business investments can be really beneficial, but the book argues that excessive cash gifts or constantly rescuing them from financial trouble can actually create a cycle of dependence.
Let them learn from their mistakes,
Right.
build that resilience.
Exactly. They actually have a really good example of this with the stories of these two sisters, Sarah and Alice.
Oh, this sounds like a juicy one. Tell me about them. How do they illustrate this point about economic outpatient care?
So Sarah and Alice both had a wealthy father who wanted to protect them from financial struggles. But he had very different approaches for each daughter.
I'm sensing some sibling rivalry here.
Oh, yeah. Sarah, the older sister, she was very independent and driven, wanted to make it on her own. Alice, on the other hand, was a little more passive and relied on her dad's support.
So how did their dad handle this difference?
Sarah's dad, even though he had plenty of money, insisted that she be financially independent, wouldn't give her handouts. He believed it would make her stronger and more resourceful.
Okay.
Alice, though, she got consistent financial support from her dad, even after she got married to a guy who wasn't doing so well financially.
Wow. He really set them on different paths.
Yeah. And Sarah, because she had to rely on herself, she developed a strong work ethic and ended up becoming really successful on her own. But Alice, she stayed financially dependent on her dad, even as an adult.
That's a powerful example of how good intentions can sometimes backfire. Sometimes the best help isn't a handout, but empowering someone to help themselves.
Exactly. The book makes it clear that real financial independence comes from facing challenges and taking responsibility, not from constantly relying on someone else's money.
Such a valuable lesson for both parents and kids. Sometimes tough love is the best love.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the long-term impact of our choices, doesn't it? One thing I was curious about was how the authors actually went about finding these millionaires for their research. Like, did they just go door to door in fancy neighborhoods?
Well, they actually talk about that in the book, which is kind of cool. They wanted to be really rigorous with their research, so they had to make sure they were studying a truly representative sample of American millionaires.
So how did they find them? There's not exactly a millionaire directory you can just look up.
Right. Well, they partnered with these companies that specialize in making those mailing lists,
Yeah.
and they used data like property values, income levels, and all kinds of demographic info to zero in on neighborhoods where there was a high concentration of affluent households.
It's like a treasure map for millionaire hunters. So they found the neighborhoods, but how did they actually get the millionaires to participate? Well, they used this technique called random sampling. They basically picked random households within those wealthy neighborhoods and sent some surveys in the mail.
Smart. That way it's not biased.
Exactly. And to make sure people felt comfortable sharing their info, they guaranteed anonymity and confidentiality,
Hmm.
which is probably why they got such a high response rate. They ended up with this huge amount of data about the habits, attitudes, and financial strategies of these millionaires.
It's amazing what you can learn when you really put in the effort to do things right. And it really shows how committed the authors were to getting accurate information.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the reasons The Millionaire Next Door is so insightful. It's not just opinions or anecdotes, it's backed up by real data and analysis.
It's a book that really makes you think differently about wealth and success, and it leaves you with some really actionable takeaways.
Yeah, it shows that financial success is possible for anyone who's willing to work for it, develop the right mindset, and make those smart choices consistently.
It's about taking control of your financial future.
Absolutely. And it also reminds us that there's no one right way to do it. It's about finding what works best for you, what aligns with your values and your goals.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into The Millionaire Next Door, is there anything else that really resonated with you? Any final thoughts for our listeners?
What really struck me was that the book isn't just about money. It touches on the importance of other kinds of wealth, too. Things like time, relationships, knowledge, health, purpose.
It's about finding that balance,
Uh,
right? Where you're financially secure, but also living a fulfilling life.
exactly. So as you think about everything we've talked about today, ask yourself, what does success really mean to you? What makes you happy? How can you align your financial decisions with those values so that you're not just building wealth, but building a life that has meaning?
Those are great questions to consider as we all continue on our journey towards a richer life in every sense of the word. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into The Millionaire Next Door. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of wealth and success. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep seeking knowledge.